I am Sarah Chen, and I died at 29 years old. Not literally, of course, but that is exactly what my father told everyone at what should have been my memorial service. Standing over my empty casket, he looked my closest friends in the eye and said I had amounted to nothing, that I was a disappointment who never lived up to my potential. What he did not know was that I was very much alive, hidden in the back of the funeral home, listening to every cruel word. What happened next when my lawyer read my will would leave him speechless and change everything he thought he knew about the daughter he had written off. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed, because tomorrow, I have saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Millfield, Connecticut, I learned early that success in the Chen household was measured by very specific metrics. My father, Robert Chen, was a successful investment banker who had built his career on calculated risks and unwavering confidence. Our colonial home on Elm Street was his monument to achievement, complete with a 3-car garage and a lawn maintained by professional landscapers. Every detail was curated to project an image of prosperity and respectability. My mother, Linda, had been a promising architect before marriage, but she abandoned her career to become the perfect wife and mother. She managed our household with military precision, organizing charity events and dinner parties that showcased our family's status in the community. Her own dreams had been carefully folded away like old blueprints, stored in an attic of memories she rarely visited. My older sister Jessica was everything my parents had hoped for in a child. 5 years my senior, she excelled at everything she touched. Valedictorian of her high school class, full scholarship to Yale, then Harvard Law School where she graduated summa cum laude. By 25, she was already a junior partner at a prestigious firm in Manhattan, living in a penthouse apartment that my father loved to mention during conversations with his colleagues. Jessica embodied every value my parents held dear, ambition wrapped in designer clothes and validated by impressive salary figures. Then there was me, the family anomaly. From the moment I could hold a crayon, I was drawn to creating things. While other children in our neighborhood played with traditional toys, I was building elaborate structures out of cardboard boxes and creating intricate drawings that covered every surface my mother would allow. My bedroom was an explosion of art supplies, sketch pads, and half-finished projects that drove my father to distraction. The first major conflict erupted when I was 12 years old. During a family dinner, my father announced that he had enrolled me in advanced mathematics and science courses for the following school year. He had it all planned out, my path to following Jessica into the world of finance or law. When I quietly mentioned that I would prefer to take additional art classes instead, the temperature in the dining room seemed to drop 10 degrees. My father set down his fork, with deliberate precision, and fixed me with the look that had intimidated countless business rivals. Art is a hobby, Sarah, not a career. You have intelligence, and I will not allow you to waste it on something as impractical as drawing pictures. The dismissal in his voice was absolute, brooking no argument. My mother reached over to touch my hand gently. Your father just wants what is best for you, sweetheart. Perhaps you could do both, the math classes and some art on the side. But I could see in her eyes the same defeated look she wore whenever her own abandoned dreams seemed to surface. Throughout middle school and high school, this pattern repeated itself endlessly. Every art award I won, every piece selected for school exhibitions, every teacher who praised my natural talent was met with polite indifference from my father. Meanwhile, Jessica's achievements were celebrated with expensive dinners and proud phone calls to relatives. Her law school graduation was marked with a party that filled our entire backyard, while my high school art scholarship was acknowledged with a brief nod and a comment about how I should still keep my grades up in real subjects. I remember the night I decided to apply to art school. I was 17, sitting in my bedroom surrounded by my portfolio pieces. For months I had been secretly working on applications to several prestigious art institutes, using money I had saved from a part-time job at a local coffee shop. The secrecy felt necessary, because I knew what my father's reaction would be. When I finally gathered the courage to tell my parents, the scene was worse than I had imagined. My father actually laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. Art school, Sarah, do you have any idea how much money I have invested in your education? Do you think I did that so you could waste 4 years learning to be a starving artist? My mother tried to mediate, as she always did. Maybe she could minor in art while studying something more practical, she suggested hopefully. But my father was already shaking his head, his decision made before I had even finished speaking. You will study business or economics, he declared. Something that will prepare you for a real career. This art nonsense has gone on long enough. I will not support any other choice financially or emotionally. The ultimatum hung in the air between us like a sword. Choose the path he had laid out for me, or lose his support entirely. At 17, facing the prospect of paying for college myself, the choice seemed impossible. So I compromised, enrolling in a state business program while secretly taking as many art electives as my schedule would allow. College was a strange double life. By day I attended lectures on marketing strategies and financial planning, subjects that felt like learning a foreign language I had no desire to speak. By night, I worked in the art studio, creating pieces that felt like breathing after being underwater all day. My business grades were mediocre at best, earning disappointed phone calls from my father who could not understand why I was not excelling like Jessica had. Your sister never struggled with her studies, he would say during our weekly check-ins. Perhaps you are not applying yourself properly. Have you considered getting a tutor for your economics classes? I wanted to tell him that I was applying myself, just not to the subjects he valued. I was spending every free moment in the ceramics studio, learning to shape clay with my hands in ways that felt more natural than any business presentation I had ever given. My pottery pieces were being selected for student exhibitions, and several professors had approached me about continuing my studies in fine arts. But those achievements remained invisible to my family. When I called home excited about having a piece accepted into a regional student art show, my father's response was to ask whether I had finished my market research assignment. The disconnect was so complete that after a while, I stopped sharing those parts of my life entirely. My mother sensed the growing distance between my father and me, and she tried in her quiet way to bridge the gap. During one of my visits home, she pulled me aside and showed me some of my childhood drawings that she had secretly saved in a box in her closet. You were always so talented, she whispered, running her fingers over a crayon drawing I had made at age 8. I wish things could be different, but wishing was all she ever offered. When it came to actually standing up to my father, she remained silent, trapped in her own pattern of deference that had been established decades earlier. Jessica, to her credit, tried to understand my perspective during the rare occasions when we were alone together. During one Christmas visit, she found me in my old bedroom, working on a small sculpture I had brought home from school. "You know Dad loves you, right?" she said, settling onto my bed to watch me work. "He just has a very specific idea of what success looks like. It worked out well for me, but I can see it is not the right fit for you." "Then why do not you tell him that?" I asked, not looking up from the clay I was shaping. "You are the golden child, he might actually listen to you." She was quiet for a long moment. "Because I am afraid that if I rock the boat, I might fall out of favor too. It is selfish, I know, but his approval has become something I depend on." Her honesty was both painful and illuminating. We were all trapped in our roles within the family dynamic, even Jessica, who seemed to have everything my parents wanted. The final confrontation of my college years came during my senior year. I had been accepted into a master's program in fine arts at a prestigious university, with a partial scholarship based on my portfolio. The opportunity was everything I had dreamed of, a chance to study under renowned artists and develop my skills in a serious academic environment. When I presented this to my parents as my plan for after graduation, my father's reaction was swift and definitive. "Absolutely not. You have a business degree, which means you can get a real job and start building a career. I will not fund 2 more years of artistic indulgence." "But Dad," I started trying to explain the significance of the program, the scholarship, the opportunities it would provide. He cut me off with a wave of his hand. "Sarah, you are 21 years old. It is time to grow up and join the real world. I have already spoken to some contacts in the financial sector who might be willing to give you an entry-level position despite your mediocre grades." The word mediocre hit like a slap. My grades were mediocre because I had been forced to study subjects that held no interest for me while pouring my real passion into pursuits he refused to acknowledge. But trying to explain this felt hopeless. My mother predictably offered her usual compromise suggestion. Maybe you could work for a few years and then revisit the art school idea later, she said hopefully. It is not like the opportunity will disappear forever. But I knew better. If I let this chance slip away, if I allowed myself to be pulled into the corporate world my father had mapped out for me, I would never find the courage to break free again. At 21, it felt like now or never. That night, I made the decision that would define the next chapter of my life. I would take the master's program opportunity, even if it meant doing it without my family's financial or emotional support. I had some money saved from years of part-time jobs, and I was willing to take on student loans for the rest. The prospect was terrifying, but less terrifying than the alternative of abandoning my dreams entirely. When I told my parents my decision the next morning, my father's face went through a series of expressions: anger, disappointment, and finally, a cold indifference that was somehow worse than his anger. "Fine," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "If you want to make this mistake, you will do it on your own. Do not expect any help from us, financial or otherwise. And do not come running back when you realize you have wasted 2 years of your life." My mother started to protest, but he silenced her with a look. "Linda, we have given Sarah every opportunity to make the right choice. If she prefers to be stubborn, that is her decision to live with." The conversation ended there, but the real end had happened long before. As I packed up my things to leave for graduate school, I realized I was not just changing academic programs. I was stepping away from a family that had never really seen or valued who I was. Graduate school was simultaneously the most challenging and most fulfilling period of my life up to that point. Surrounded by other artists who understood the compulsion to create, I felt like I could finally breathe fully for the first time. My professors pushed me to explore new techniques and concepts, expanding my abilities beyond what I had thought possible. The program was rigorous, demanding not just technical skill but intellectual engagement with art history, theory, and contemporary practice. For the first time in my academic life, I excelled not because I was forcing myself to care, but because I genuinely loved what I was studying. My thesis project was a series of ceramic installations that explored themes of identity and belonging. The pieces were large, complex works that required months of planning and execution. When the final exhibition opened, the response was overwhelming. Art critics from several major publications attended, and 2 of my pieces were acquired by collectors before the show even officially opened. I called home to share this news, hoping that perhaps concrete evidence of professional recognition might help my parents understand the legitimacy of my chosen path. My mother answered the phone and listened with what sounded like genuine pride as I described the exhibition and the sales. "That is wonderful, sweetheart," she said. "I wish I could have been there to see it." But when I asked to speak to my father, she hesitated. "He is very busy with work lately," she said carefully. "Maybe you could try calling back this weekend." But the weekend came and went without a returned call. Eventually I realized that my father had made his position clear. As long as I persisted in pursuing art, I simply did not exist in his world. The isolation was painful, but it also forced me to build a different kind of support network.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
My professors became mentors. My fellow students became collaborators and friends. I learned to navigate the art world on my own, attending gallery openings and networking events, where I gradually made connections that would prove crucial to my future success. One of those connections came through my thesis advisor, Professor Martinez, who introduced me to gallery owner Eleanor Whitman after seeing my exhibition. Eleanor ran a respected contemporary gallery in downtown Hartford, about an hour from where I had grown up. She was a sharp, insightful woman in her 50s, who had built her reputation by identifying promising artists early in their careers. "Your work has a maturity that is unusual for someone your age," she told me over coffee after viewing my thesis show. "I think there could be a place for it in the contemporary market if you are serious about pursuing this professionally." That conversation led to my first solo exhibition just 6 months after graduate school. It was a small show, only 8 pieces, but it sold out on opening night. Standing in that gallery, surrounded by people who appreciated and understood my work, I felt a validation that I had never experienced before. I tried once more to share this milestone with my family, calling home the night after the opening. My mother answered, as she always did, and I could hear the happiness in her voice as I described the success of the show. "Oh, Sarah, that is incredible," she said. "I am so proud of you." But then her voice dropped to a whisper. "Your father is not ready to hear about this yet. He is still hoping you will change your mind about all of this." The hoping part stung the most. After years of evidence that I was not only committed to this path, but succeeding at it, he was still waiting for me to give up and return to his vision of my life. My success with Eleanor's gallery led to introductions to other dealers and collectors. Within 2 years, I was represented by galleries in 3 different cities, and my work was being acquired by serious collectors who appreciated the technical skill and emotional depth of my pieces. But perhaps more importantly, I was happy. I woke up every morning excited to get to my studio, eager to explore new ideas and push my technical abilities further. The work was challenging and demanding, requiring not just creative vision but business acumen as I learned to navigate contracts, pricing, and the complex dynamics of the art market. I was also making good money, better money than many of my business school classmates who had followed more traditional corporate paths. My pieces were selling for increasingly higher prices, and I was beginning to receive commission requests from collectors who wanted specific works created for their homes or offices. Yet none of these external validations seemed to matter to my father. On the rare occasions when I spoke with my mother, she would mention that he still introduced me to people as his daughter who was figuring things out, as if my chosen career was a temporary phase rather than a serious profession. The distance between us grew wider with each passing year. I stopped calling regularly, tired of the polite but strained conversations with my mother and the complete avoidance from my father. Holiday visits became increasingly uncomfortable, with my artistic career treated like an embarrassing family secret that everyone preferred to ignore. During one particularly tense Christmas dinner, when I was 25 and had just signed with a major gallery in New York, my father made a comment that crystallized years of frustration. A family friend had asked what I was doing for work, and my father responded that I was still involved in art but would probably be looking for something more stable soon. Actually, I interrupted, unable to stay silent any longer. I just signed with Thompson Gallery in Manhattan. They are one of the most prestigious contemporary galleries in the city. My father looked at me as if I had announced I was joining the circus. Thompson Gallery, I have never heard of it. How much money can you possibly be making from this hobby? The word hobby felt like a physical blow. I had been supporting myself entirely through my art for 3 years, had work in private collections across the country, and had been featured in several art publications. Yet to him, it was still just a hobby. Jessica tried to mediate, mentioning that she had read about Thompson Gallery in an art magazine. But my father had already dismissed the topic, turning the conversation to Jessica's latest promotion and the new house she and her husband were considering. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by remnants of the girl I used to be, I made a decision that would shape the final years of my relationship with my family. I would stop trying to gain my father's approval or understanding. His inability to see value in my work was his limitation, not mine. From that point forward, my contact with my family became minimal and purely functional. I sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts, attended major family events when absolutely necessary, but I stopped sharing details of my professional life or seeking their emotional support. This decision was both liberating and lonely. Liberating because it freed me from the constant disappointment of seeking validation that would never come. Lonely because it meant accepting that my family and I had fundamentally different values and ways of understanding success and meaning in life. My art continued to evolve and gain recognition. By my late 20s, I was having regular solo exhibitions, my work was being acquired by museums, and I had been featured in several major art publications. I was invited to speak at conferences and teach workshops, sharing my techniques with other artists who appreciated the innovation I was bringing to ceramic arts, but the professional success came with personal costs. The long hours in the studio, the constant pressure to produce new work for exhibitions, and the emotional isolation from my family began to take their toll on my health. I was working 12 to 14-hour days regularly, fueled by coffee and the relentless drive to prove something to people who had already made up their minds about me. I rarely dated, finding it difficult to explain to potential partners why I had so little contact with my family or why I seemed to carry an invisible burden of always needing to justify my life choices. The few relationships I did attempt usually ended when the other person realized that my work would always come first, that I was trying to fill an emotional void through professional achievement. My mother occasionally expressed concern about my isolation, but always in the context of hoping I would reconsider my relationship with my father, rather than questioning whether his behavior was justified. "Have you thought about reaching out to him?" she would ask during our brief phone calls. "I think he misses you, even if he would not say so." But I had long since stopped believing that reconciliation was possible without me abandoning the life I had built. My father had made it clear that his love and acceptance were conditional on me becoming someone I was not. I had chosen authenticity over approval, and while that choice had led to professional fulfillment, it had also led to profound personal loneliness. The physical and emotional strain of maintaining this pace, while carrying the weight of family rejection, finally caught up with me during the winter I turned 28. I had been working on a major installation for a museum exhibition, pieces that were larger and more technically demanding than anything I had attempted before. The work required precise timing and technique, and I was pushing myself to complete it within an impossible deadline. I was sleeping 4 hours a night, eating irregularly, and ignoring the persistent cough and fatigue that had been building for weeks. The collapse happened on a Tuesday morning in my studio. One moment I was standing at my work table, contemplating the piece I was glazing, and the next I was on the floor, my vision swimming and my chest feeling like someone had placed a weight on it. The ambulance ride to the hospital was a blur, but I remember the paramedic asking if there was someone they should call. The question stopped me cold. After years of building a successful career and establishing myself as a respected artist, I realized I had no one to call who would drop everything and come to the hospital. My mother would come, eventually, but she would also bring my father's disapproval and lectures about how this was what happened when you lived an irresponsible lifestyle. Jessica would visit when her schedule allowed, but she had her own family and career demands. My few close friends were scattered across the country, pursuing their own artistic careers. The diagnosis was pneumonia, exacerbated by exhaustion and stress. The doctor, a kind woman in her 40s, was frank about the seriousness of my condition. "You are severely dehydrated and your immune system is compromised," she told me. "This is what happens when you do not take care of yourself. You need rest, real rest, not just a few days off." I spent a week in the hospital, during which time my mother visited twice, and my father not at all. Jessica came once, bringing flowers and worried questions about whether I had been eating properly and getting enough sleep. But even in her concern, I could sense her inability to truly understand the pressure I had been putting myself under, or why I felt compelled to work so relentlessly. During those quiet days in the hospital bed, I had time to reflect on the path that had led me there. I had achieved everything I had set out to accomplish professionally. My work was respected, my career was thriving, and I was financially independent. Yet I felt emptier than ever, as if I had been running a race toward a finish line that kept moving further away. The realization that hit me most powerfully was how much of my drive had been motivated not by pure love of the work, but by a desperate need to prove my worth to people who had already decided I had none. I was creating beautiful, meaningful art, but I was also slowly destroying myself in the process. When I was released from the hospital, I made several important changes to my life. I hired an assistant to help manage the business aspects of my career, allowing me to focus more on the creative work itself. I began working with a therapist to address the emotional patterns that had led to my self-destructive behavior. And I started saying no to opportunities that did not align with my values or well-being, even if they offered prestige or money. Most importantly, I began to rebuild connections with people who valued me for who I was rather than who they thought I should become. I reconnected with old friends from graduate school, joined a community of local artists, and slowly began to create the support network I had been missing. But the relationship with my family remained frozen in its pattern of polite distance and fundamental misunderstanding. My father continued to dismiss my career as a phase. My mother continued to hope for reconciliation that would require me to abandon my authentic self, and Jessica continued to love me while being unable to truly advocate for me within our family system. By the time I turned 29, I had found a healthier balance in my life. My work was still demanding and meaningful, but I had learned to set boundaries that protected my physical and emotional well-being. I was in a stable relationship with another artist who understood the demands of creative work, and I had cultivated friendships that provided the emotional support my family had never offered. Yet the wound of family rejection still ached, perhaps more deeply because I had finally found the happiness and stability that made their absence more noticeable. I was successful by any measure that mattered to me, but I remained invisible to the people who had raised me. It was during this period of relative peace and success that I began to develop the plan that would ultimately lead to the strange events of my fake funeral. The idea came to me gradually, born from years of wondering what it would take to make my family truly see me and understand what they had rejected. The plan began to take shape during one of my therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Holloway, a woman whose gentle but direct approach had helped me process years of family dysfunction. I had been sharing my frustration about an upcoming family gathering where I knew my father would once again dismiss my career achievements in front of extended relatives. "What would it take for them to truly see you?" she asked during one particularly intense session. "Not just acknowledge you, but really understand what they have been missing all these years." The question haunted me for weeks. I found myself sketching scenarios in my notebook, imagining different ways the truth might finally break through their willful blindness. It was during one of these brainstorming sessions that the idea first occurred to me, so outrageous and dramatic that I initially dismissed it as the product of an overactive imagination. But the more I thought about it, the more the plan began to make sense. My family had spent years acting as if I did not exist in any meaningful way. What if I actually did not exist? What if they were forced to confront exactly what they had lost through their rejection? The logistics were complex, requiring careful coordination with several trusted friends and professional contacts. My partner Marcus was initially skeptical when I explained what I wanted to do. "That sounds incredibly risky, Sarah," he said, running his hands through his hair as he did when he was processing something overwhelming. "What if it backfires? What if they react worse than you expect?" I had considered that possibility extensively. The worst-case scenario was that my father would remain unmoved even by my supposed death, confirming once and for all that our relationship was beyond repair. But I had reached a point where I needed to know definitively, rather than continuing to wonder what might be possible. My friend Elena Martinez, who worked as an event coordinator, became my primary accomplice in orchestrating the elaborate deception. She had experience managing complex logistics and understood the importance of every detail being perfect. We spent months planning every aspect of the fake funeral, from the venue selection to the guest list coordination. The hardest part was deciding who to trust with the truth. I needed enough people to make the event convincing, but not so many that the secret would leak prematurely. Elena brought in her cousin Miguel, who worked in theater production and could handle the technical aspects of creating a believable funeral setting. Marcus reluctantly agreed to help, though he continued to express concerns about the emotional risk I was taking. My gallery representative, Eleanor, was perhaps the most crucial ally. She not only agreed to participate but offered to make the revelation of my financial success more dramatic by bringing actual documentation of my career earnings and current net worth. The numbers had grown substantially in recent years, reaching figures that would surprise even me when laid out comprehensively. The challenge was creating a believable reason for my supposed death that would not cause unnecessary trauma for my family. We settled on a fictional car accident during a late-night drive to my studio, something sudden and tragic but not suspicious or drawn out. Elena worked with Miguel to create false documentation and coordinate with a sympathetic funeral director who agreed to allow us to use his facilities for our staged event. Meanwhile, I had to carefully distance myself from my normal life without raising suspicions. I told my mother I was taking a sabbatical to work on a major new series, which would explain why I might be less available for phone calls. I arranged for my studio assistant to handle any urgent business matters, and instructed my galleries to hold off on any major announcements or exhibitions for the next few months. The emotional preparation was more challenging than the practical arrangements. I spent weeks processing with Dr. Holloway what I hoped to achieve and what I was prepared to accept if the results were disappointing.
We developed strategies for handling various potential outcomes, from complete family breakdown to continued rejection even in the face of my supposed death. The night before the staged funeral, I barely slept. I kept running through all the details, wondering if I had considered every possible complication. What if someone called the police to investigate? What if my father became so distraught that he had a medical emergency? What if the whole elaborate plan simply reinforced his view that I was dramatic and attention-seeking? Elena picked me up at dawn, and we drove to the funeral home where Miguel had spent the previous day setting up the scene. The casket was closed, supposedly because of the extent of my injuries from the car accident. Flowers had been arranged around the room, including some pieces I had specifically requested because I knew they held significance for different family members. The guest list was carefully curated to include people my family would recognize as legitimate mourners. Several of my fellow artists agreed to attend and speak about my work and character. Professor Martinez drove up from the university where I had completed my graduate degree. Eleanor arranged for two prominent collectors who owned my pieces to be present, though they would remain anonymous to my family unless specifically introduced. My hiding place was a small office adjacent to the main chapel, with a one-way window that would allow me to see and hear everything that happened. Miguel had set up a discreet audio system so I could follow conversations throughout the room. The technical setup was more elaborate than I had anticipated, but Elena insisted that if we were going to do this, every detail needed to be perfect. The first guests began arriving at 10 in the morning. I watched through my hidden window as my art world friends and colleagues gathered, many of them genuinely emotional about participating in this deception. They understood the years of family rejection I had experienced and were invested in helping me finally get answers about where I stood with the people who had raised me. Professor Martinez spoke with Elena about my graduate work, sharing memories that would sound authentic to anyone listening. Two of my collector friends discussed specific pieces they owned, providing concrete evidence of my professional success for anyone who might be paying attention to such details. Then my family arrived, and my heart began racing in a way that made me grateful Miguel had thought to keep water and emergency supplies in my hiding place. My mother entered first, supported by Jessica and her husband David. She looked smaller than I remembered, her face marked by the kind of grief that ages a person overnight. Jessica was composed but clearly emotional, functioning in her typical role as the family organizer even in crisis. My father came in last, his expression unreadable behind the controlled mask he wore for public occasions. He had dressed in his most expensive suit, the one he reserved for board meetings and major court appearances. Even in grief, he was concerned with projecting the right image. The first hour of the service proceeded as I had expected. Various speakers shared memories and praised my character, though I noticed my father seemed largely disengaged from these testimonials. He sat rigidly in the front row, checking his phone periodically and giving the impression that he was enduring rather than participating in the ceremony. My mother was clearly devastated, dabbing at her eyes continuously and leaning heavily on Jessica for support. Jessica herself seemed torn between grief and the practical concerns of managing family logistics during a crisis. She spoke briefly about our childhood, sharing memories that painted me in a loving but somewhat patronizing light, as the artistic little sister who had always marched to her own drummer. The first crack in my father's composure came when Professor Martinez approached him during a break between speakers. I strained to hear their conversation from my hiding place, grateful for Miguel's audio setup. "Mr. Chen, I wanted to express my condolences," Professor Martinez said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Sarah was one of the most talented students I worked with in 30 years of teaching. Her thesis exhibition was remarkable. My father looked at him with polite confusion. "Thank you, Professor. She always enjoyed her art classes." "This was more than classes, sir," Professor Martinez continued gently. Sarah completed her Master of Fine Arts degree with distinction. Her work was selected for several prestigious exhibitions while she was still a student. We had high hopes for her professional career. I watched my father's face carefully, looking for any sign that this information was penetrating his deliberate indifference. His expression remained controlled, but I noticed his hand tighten slightly on the arm of his chair. "Well, she certainly was creative," he replied non-committally. "Though I always hoped she would find something more stable eventually." Professor Martinez looked at him with poorly concealed surprise. Sarah was already established professionally. Her work was being collected by major art patrons across the country. She was invited to speak at conferences and teach workshops. This was not a hobby. My father shifted uncomfortably but maintained his dismissive stance. "I suppose there are people who will buy anything these days. The art market has always been unpredictable." The conversation ended there, but I could see that Professor Martinez was shaken by my father's response. He walked away with the expression of someone who had encountered something inexplicable and disturbing. The second major revelation came when Eleanor approached my parents with a folder of documentation she had prepared specifically for this moment. I had given her permission to share details about my career earnings and current financial status, information that I knew would speak my father's language in a way that artistic acclaim could not. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen," Eleanor said, introducing herself with professional confidence. "I am Eleanor Whitman, Sarah's primary gallery representative. I wanted to ensure you received these documents regarding her estate and professional accomplishments." She handed my mother a thick folder while speaking directly to my father. "Sarah was one of our most successful artists. Her work has been acquired by collectors internationally, and her pieces regularly sold for prices ranging from $15,000 to $60,000 each." My father looked up from his phone for the first time all morning. $60,000? For what? "For individual ceramic sculptures and installations," Eleanor replied calmly. "Sarah completed approximately 8 to 12 major pieces per year, in addition to smaller works and commissioned projects. Her total annual income from art sales alone was typically between $400,000 and $600,000. The folder slipped from my mother's hands, papers scattering across the floor as she stared at Eleanor in shock. "That cannot be right," she whispered. "Art does not pay that kind of money." Eleanor began collecting the papers while continuing to speak. "These documents include sales receipts, exhibition catalogs, and financial statements from the past 5 years. Sarah was also receiving regular commissions from private collectors and had been selected for several museum acquisitions." My father stood up abruptly, his face flushed with what I recognized as anger rather than grief. "Why are you telling us this now?" he demanded. "What difference does it make?" Eleanor looked at him with the steady gaze of someone accustomed to dealing with difficult people. "I thought you might want to understand what Sarah accomplished during her career. She was extraordinarily successful by any measure." "Successful at what?" My father shot back, his voice rising enough to draw attention from other mourners. "Making clay pots that rich people buy as decoration. That is not success, that is taking advantage of people with more money than sense." The room had gone quiet, conversations stopping as people turned to witness what was clearly becoming a confrontation. I pressed closer to my hidden window, my heart pounding as I realized this was the moment I had both hoped for and dreaded. Eleanor maintained her professional composure despite my father's hostility. "Chen, your daughter was a respected artist whose work is held in private collections and museum permanent collections. She supported herself entirely through her art for over 7 years. She owned her studio, her home, and had substantial savings and investments." My father laughed, the sound sharp and bitter in the funeral chapel. "Substantial savings? From making pottery? I find that very difficult to believe." Jessica had been listening to this exchange with growing discomfort, and she finally intervened. "Dad, maybe you should look at the documents before dismissing what Miss Whitman is telling us." "I do not need to look at anything," he replied, but his voice had dropped back to a normal volume as he became aware that people were watching. Sarah was a dreamer who never learned to live in the real world. Whatever money she might have made was probably a fluke. Eleanor opened her briefcase and withdrew another folder, this one containing bank statements and investment documents that I had authorized her to share. "Mr. Chen, your daughter's current net worth at the time of her death was approximately $2.3 million. The chapel fell completely silent. My mother made a sound that was somewhere between a gasp and a sob. Jessica stared at Eleanor as if she had announced that I had been secretly working for NASA. Even David, who rarely showed surprise about anything, looked stunned. My father's reaction was the most complex. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, anger, and something that might have been recognition. But instead of the breakthrough moment I had been hoping for, he seemed to retreat further into defensive hostility. "That is impossible," he said flatly. "No one makes that kind of money from art unless they are already famous. You must be including family money or some other source of income." Eleanor shook her head. "These figures represent income solely from Sarah's art sales, minus business expenses and taxes. She built this success entirely through her own work over the past decade." "She is lying," my father announced to the room, as if Eleanor were not standing directly in front of him. "This is some kind of scam to make us feel guilty. Sarah was never financially responsible. She was always chasing unrealistic dreams." The cruelty of his response, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, struck me like a physical blow. I had prepared myself for disbelief, but the active hostility in his voice as he dismissed not just my success but my integrity was worse than anything I had imagined. Eleanor tried once more to break through his resistance. "Mr. Chen, I understand this information is surprising, but I can provide additional documentation if necessary." Sarah was planning to establish a foundation for supporting young artists. She was also considering purchasing a larger studio space to expand her work. My father turned away from her entirely, addressing my mother as if Eleanor had ceased to exist. "Linda, we should go. This whole thing has become a circus." Sarah would be embarrassed by this display, but my mother was staring at the scattered papers on the floor, her face pale with shock. "Robert, what if she is telling the truth? What if Sarah really was successful and we never knew?" "She was not successful," he snapped. "Success means building something lasting, contributing to society in a meaningful way. Playing with clay and convincing rich people to waste their money is not success." I had heard enough. The whole elaborate plan, months of careful preparation and emotional investment, had led to this moment of ultimate rejection. Even confronted with undeniable proof of my professional achievements and financial success, my father was choosing to maintain his dismissive stance rather than acknowledge that he might have been wrong about me. But the most devastating part was still to come. As mourners began to move toward the reception area, I heard my father speaking quietly to a small group that included Jessica, David, and a few family friends who had attended the service. "I want everyone to understand something," he said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used in boardrooms. "Sarah was a good person, but she was also deeply troubled. She never learned to accept reality or make practical decisions. This whole art thing was just an elaborate way of avoiding real responsibility." One of the family friends, Mrs. Patterson, looked uncomfortable. "But Robert, if what that gallery woman said is true, then Sarah was quite successful at what she chose to do." My father's response was swift and definitive. "That woman is either deluded or lying for her own purposes." I knew my daughter better than anyone. Sarah was creative, yes, but she was also impractical and stubborn. She chose a path that led nowhere, and now look what has happened. He gestured around the funeral chapel as if my supposed death was the inevitable result of my life choices. "This is what happens when you refuse to listen to people who know better, when you insist on following unrealistic dreams instead of building a solid foundation." Jessica tried to mediate, as she always did. "Dad, I think you might be in shock. Maybe we should wait before making judgments about Sarah's life." "There is nothing to judge," he replied. "Sarah made her choices, and they were poor choices. I loved her despite her stubbornness, but I will not pretend that her life was something it was not just because she is gone." The words hit me with devastating clarity. Even faced with proof of my success, even mourning what he believed was my death, my father was incapable of acknowledging that my life had value on its own terms. The elaborate deception I had orchestrated had not revealed hidden love or regret, it had only confirmed the depth of his rejection. Mrs. Patterson made one more attempt to challenge his perspective. "Robert, surely you must feel some regret about not being closer to Sarah during her final years." My father was quiet for a moment, and I held my breath hoping that perhaps some genuine emotion might finally break through. When he spoke, His words were measured and deliberate. "Of course I regret that Sarah and I were not closer," he said, "but that was her choice, not mine. I offered her every opportunity to build a real career, to use her intelligence for something worthwhile. She chose to be stubborn instead." He paused, looking around the group as if to ensure they understood his position. Sarah was nothing, professionally speaking. She had potential that she wasted on childish pursuits. I cannot pretend otherwise just because we are at her funeral. The word nothing echoed through my mind as I sat in my hidden room, processing the full impact of what I had just witnessed. Not disappointing, not misguided, not even wrong, nothing. In my father's assessment, my life had amounted to nothing regardless of financial success, professional recognition, or personal fulfillment. The reception continued for another hour, but I had heard everything I needed to hear. Elena found me in my hiding place, her face reflecting her own shock at what had transpired. "Sarah, I am so sorry," she whispered. "I never expected him to react that way. Even with all the evidence, he just refused to see it." I nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in my throat. The plan had worked exactly as intended. I had gotten my answer about where I stood with my family. The problem was that the answer was worse than I had ever imagined. Marcus appeared a few minutes later, his expression grim. "We need to get you out of here," he said gently. "This has gone on long enough." As Elena helped me gather my things, I could hear the mourners beginning to leave the chapel. My mother's voice carried through the walls, still asking questions about the financial documents Eleanor had shared. Jessica was trying to manage logistics while processing the revelations about my career, and my father was maintaining his dismissive stance, apparently unmoved by anything he had learned. We slipped out through a back entrance, Miguel ensuring that no one would see us leaving. As we drove away from the funeral home, I felt a complex mixture of relief and devastation. The elaborate deception was over, but the emotional reckoning was just beginning. I had gotten the definitive answer I had been seeking for years. My father's love and approval were not just conditionally unavailable, they were fundamentally impossible given his worldview and values. No amount of success, no level of achievement, no proof of my worth would ever be sufficient to change his assessment of my life. The drive back to my apartment was silent, each of us processing what we had witnessed in our own way. Elena kept glancing at me in the rearview mirror, clearly worried about my emotional state. Marcus sat beside me holding my hand, providing silent support while respecting my need to absorb what had happened. When we reached my building, I realized that I now faced the complex task of returning from the dead without anyone discovering the deception. The practical challenges seemed almost insurmountable, but they paled in comparison to the emotional work I needed to do to process what I had learned about my family and myself. As I sat in my living room that evening, surrounded by evidence of the life I had built independently, I began to understand that the fake funeral had been both a complete success and a devastating failure. I had gotten exactly the information I sought, but that information had shattered my remaining hopes for family reconciliation in ways I was only beginning to comprehend. The next phase of this strange journey would require me to find a way to come back to life while processing the reality that I had been dead to my father all along. The hardest part about coming back from the dead was pretending I had never been gone. For 3 days after the funeral, I remained hidden in my apartment while Elena and Marcus worked to carefully unravel the deception. They had to contact everyone who had participated, ensuring that news of my miraculous survival would spread through the right channels without raising suspicions about the elaborate staging we had orchestrated. The cover story we developed was that there had been a terrible mistake with victim identification after the car accident. While I had indeed been in an accident, I had been unconscious in a hospital under a different name, due to confusion with my identification. When I finally woke up and could provide my correct information, the error was discovered just as my funeral was taking place. Elena handled the logistics of contacting the funeral home and explaining the situation to them, while Marcus managed communications with my art world contacts. Miguel dismantled the technical setup and ensured that no evidence remained of our deception. It was a delicate process that required each person to play their role perfectly. On the fourth day, Elena called my mother to deliver the shocking news that I was alive. I listened to her side of the conversation from my kitchen, hearing my mother's screams of joy and disbelief through the phone. The emotional intensity of her reaction made me question whether putting her through this ordeal had been worth the information I had gained. Within hours, my phone was ringing constantly. My mother called sobbing, barely able to form coherent sentences through her relief and confusion. Jessica called, demanding explanations that I could not fully provide without revealing the deception. Even David called to express his amazement at what seemed like a miraculous turn of events. My father did not call. 3 days passed before I heard from him directly, and when he finally did contact me, it was through a brief text message that read simply, "Glad you are okay. We should talk when you are ready." The clinical tone was so familiar that it felt like he had never mourned my supposed death at all. I spent the following week in therapy sessions with Dr. Holloway, processing the complex emotions surrounding what I had learned during the funeral. The plan had succeeded in giving me absolute clarity about my father's feelings, but that clarity came with a grief I had not anticipated. I was mourning not just the father I had never had, but also the hope I had carried that someday he might change. Dr. Holloway helped me understand that the funeral had been a form of closure, allowing me to finally stop seeking validation that would never come. The pain was intense, but it was also liberating in ways I was only beginning to appreciate. 2 weeks after my resurrection, my mother called with news that would set the final act of this strange drama into motion. She was speaking in the careful tone she used when trying to manage family tensions, but I could hear excitement underneath her diplomatic language. "Sarah, sweetheart, I have been thinking about everything that happened, about what we learned from that gallery woman during the service," she began. "I know your father has his opinions, but I think we need to have a family conversation about your career and your life." I listened with curiosity as she continued. "I have been doing some research on my own, looking up your name online and reading about your exhibitions. Sarah, why did we never know about any of this? Why did you never tell us how successful you had become?" The question was both fair and painful. How could I explain that I had tried for years to share my achievements, only to have them dismissed or ignored? How could I make her understand that her own silence in the face of my father's rejection had been part of the problem? "I tried, Mom," I said carefully. "I tried many times to share what was happening in my career, but Dad always changed the subject or made it clear he was not interested. After a while, it became easier to just stop trying." She was quiet for a moment. "I think I knew that," she admitted. "I just told myself that maybe you were exaggerating, or that it was not as serious as you made it sound. It was easier than confronting your father about his attitude." Her honesty was both painful and encouraging. For the first time, she was acknowledging her own role in the family dynamics that had isolated me for so many years. "I want to make this right, Sarah," she continued. "I have been working on your father, trying to help him understand what he missed. I think there might be a way to bring the family back together if we approach this carefully." I appreciated her intentions, but I had learned too much during the funeral to believe that my father was capable of the kind of fundamental change that would be required for genuine reconciliation. Still, I agreed to consider a family meeting, if she thought it might help. The conversation that resulted from my mother's intervention took place 3 weeks later at my childhood home. I had not been in that house for over a year, and walking through the front door felt like entering a museum of my own past. Everything was exactly as I remembered, including the conspicuous absence of any evidence that I had ever lived there. Jessica and David were already there when I arrived, along with my parents. The atmosphere was tense but hopeful, as if everyone was trying very hard to make this work. My mother had prepared coffee and arranged chairs in the living room, in a way that suggested she had given considerable thought to the logistics of this encounter. My father looked older than I remembered, and there was something different in his demeanor, less commanding and more uncertain. He greeted me with an awkward hug and asked about my recovery from the accident in a tone that suggested genuine concern. We spent the first hour discussing practical matters, my health, my living situation, and the confusion surrounding the mistaken identity that had led to the funeral. My parents asked careful questions, and I provided the rehearsed answers that Elena and I had prepared to explain the supposed mix-up. Then Jessica, clearly designated as the family mediator, brought up the topic we were all avoiding. "Sarah," she began, "we learned some things at the funeral about your career that none of us really understood before. Mom has been doing research, and it seems like you have been quite successful with your art. We want to understand why we never knew about this." I looked around the room, seeing expectation in every face except my father's. He was studying his hands with the expression of someone who would rather be anywhere else. "I have tried to share my career developments with the family for years," I said carefully. "Every exhibition, every award, every major sale, I would call or mention it during visits." The response was usually either polite disinterest or active dismissal. My mother shifted uncomfortably. "I think we may not have understood how significant these things were," she said.
When you said you had a gallery showing, I pictured something small, maybe local. I did not realize you were talking about major exhibitions with serious collectors." Jessica nodded in agreement. "And when you mentioned sales, I assumed you meant a few $100s here and there, enough to supplement your income, but not enough to actually live on." The conversation continued for another hour, with my mother and Jessica asking detailed questions about my career and expressing amazement at the scope of my professional success. They seemed genuinely interested in understanding not just the financial aspects but also the artistic recognition I had received. Throughout this discussion, my father remained largely silent, occasionally looking up when specific dollar amounts were mentioned, but offering no comments or questions of his own. Finally, Jessica addressed him directly. "Dad, what do you think about all this? Are not you surprised by what Sarah has accomplished?" He looked up slowly, his expression unreadable. "I suppose I am surprised by the financial aspects," he said carefully. "I never would have imagined that art could be so lucrative." "But what about the artistic recognition?" my mother prompted. "The museum acquisitions, the critical reviews, the invitations to speak at conferences." My father shrugged. "I still do not really understand that world," he admitted. "It seems very subjective to me, not like the concrete achievements you can measure in business or law." The old dismissiveness was still there, more subtle than before, but unmistakable. Even faced with overwhelming evidence of my success, he could not bring himself to acknowledge that my chosen field had inherent value. Jessica tried a different approach. "Dad, regardless of whether you understand the art world, Sarah has clearly built a successful business and established herself professionally. Is not that what you always wanted for her?" "What I wanted for her was security and stability," he replied. "I wanted her to build something lasting, something she could depend on. The art market is unpredictable. What happens if tastes change, or the economy shifts?" His response revealed the core of his inability to accept my choices. No amount of evidence about my current success would matter to him because he remained convinced that my career was inherently unstable and therefore invalid. The meeting continued for another hour, but it became clear that we were not going to achieve the breakthrough my mother had hoped for. My father was willing to acknowledge my financial success, but unwilling to validate my life choices or admit that he might have been wrong about the viability of an artistic career. As the family gathering was winding down, my mother made a suggestion that would lead to the final revelation of this entire saga. "Sarah," she said, "I think it would help if we could see your work, maybe visit your studio so we can better understand what you do. Would that be possible?" I agreed, partly out of curiosity about how my family would respond to seeing my artistic environment, and partly because I had one more surprise that I had not yet shared with anyone. The studio visit was scheduled for the following weekend. My workspace was located in a converted warehouse that I shared with several other artists, a professional environment that I hoped would help my family understand the serious nature of my career. When they arrived, I could see them taking in the scale and sophistication of the setup. My area included not just workspace for creating pieces but also storage for finished works, a small office area for managing business affairs, and professional photography equipment for documenting completed pieces. Jessica and my mother asked thoughtful questions about my process, examining works in various stages of completion, and showing genuine interest in understanding the technical aspects of my craft.
My father walked through the space politely, but with the detached air of someone touring a facility that held no personal meaning for him. The tour concluded in my office area, where I had prepared materials for the conversation I knew we needed to have. During the weeks since my resurrection, I had been working with my financial advisor and attorney to finalize plans I had been developing for months before staging my fake death. I have something I want to share with all of you, I began, settling into my desk chair, while they arranged themselves in the small seating area I had set up for client meetings. I opened a folder containing documents that represented the culmination of years of financial planning and soul-searching about what I wanted my legacy to be. Over the past 2 years, I have been working with advisors to establish a foundation that will support emerging artists, I explained. The Sarah Chen Foundation will provide grants, workspace, and mentorship opportunities for young people who want to pursue careers in the arts but lack family support or financial resources. My mother looked intrigued. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. How much money are we talking about? I took a deep breath, preparing to share information that would shift the entire dynamic of our family relationships. I am donating $1.8 million to establish and fund the foundation, I said. The remaining portion of my assets will be held in trust to ensure the foundation's continued operation for at least 20 years. The room went completely silent. Jessica stared at me as if I had announced I was planning to move to Mars. My mother's mouth opened and closed several times without producing any sound. My father's reaction was the most complex. His face went through the same series of expressions I had observed during the funeral, shock giving way to disbelief, and then to something that looked almost like anger. Sarah, Jessica finally managed, are you saying you are giving away almost all of your money? Not giving it away, I corrected. Investing it in something that matters to me. I have kept enough to maintain my current lifestyle and continue my work, but I want the bulk of my assets to make a difference for other artists who are facing the same kinds of family opposition I experienced. My mother leaned forward, still processing what I had told them. But sweetheart, what about your future? What about retirement, or if you get sick, or if you want to start a family? I have planned for all of those contingencies, I assured her. The amount I am keeping is substantial enough to provide security while still allowing the foundation to have real impact. Throughout this discussion, my father had remained silent, his expression growing darker as he absorbed the implications of what I was telling them. Finally he spoke, and his words revealed that even now, even faced with evidence of both my success and my philanthropic intentions, he remained fundamentally unchanged. This is exactly what I have been worried about all these years, he said, his voice tight with frustration. You make impractical decisions without considering the long-term consequences. Giving away that kind of money to help other people pursue unrealistic dreams is just throwing good resources after bad. The familiar dismissiveness in his tone confirmed what I had learned during the funeral. No amount of success, no level of financial stability, no evidence of thoughtful planning would ever be sufficient to earn his respect or approval. But something had changed in me during this long, strange process of death and resurrection. His disapproval no longer carried the power to wound me the way it once had. I had gotten the definitive answer I needed about his capacity for change, and that knowledge had freed me from the exhausting cycle of seeking validation that would never come. Dad, I said calmly, I appreciate your concern, but this is my decision to make with my money. I am 29 years old, financially independent, and clear about my values and priorities. Jessica tried to mediate, suggesting that perhaps I could start with a smaller donation and see how things developed. My mother wondered if there might be a way to structure the foundation differently to preserve more of my personal assets. But I had already made my decision, based not just on my financial situation, but on everything I had learned about myself and my family through this entire ordeal. The foundation was officially established 6 months later, with an inaugural grant program that provided support for 12 emerging artists in its first year. The ceremony marking its launch was attended by many of my colleagues from the art world, several prominent collectors, and Professor Martinez, who agreed to serve on the advisory board. My family's attendance at the ceremony was mixed. My mother came and seemed genuinely proud, as I spoke about the foundation's mission and the difference it would make for young artists. Jessica attended with David, both of them asking thoughtful questions about how the selection process would work and expressing admiration for what I was trying to accomplish. My father did not attend. In the months that followed, I found myself settling into a new equilibrium with my family relationships. My mother and I began having regular conversations that went beyond surface pleasantries, discussing not just my work but also her own dreams and regrets. She started taking art classes at a local community college, explaining that watching me pursue my passion had inspired her to reconnect with her own abandoned interests. Jessica and I developed a closer relationship as well, bonded by shared understanding of family dynamics and mutual respect for each other's achievements. She began collecting my work, not out of family obligation, but because she genuinely appreciated the pieces I was creating. My relationship with my father remained cordial but distant. We spoke occasionally, usually when family logistics required coordination, but the fundamental disconnect between our values and worldviews never changed. The difference was that I no longer expected or hoped for it to change. The foundation grew rapidly, attracting additional donors and expanding its programs beyond what I had originally envisioned. Within 2 years, we were supporting 50 artists annually, and had developed partnerships with galleries and educational institutions across the country. The most rewarding aspect of the work was meeting the young artists who received grants and seeing how the support enabled them to pursue their dreams, despite family opposition or financial constraints. Many of them shared stories remarkably similar to my own, tales of parents who could not understand or support artistic ambitions, and young people who felt caught between family expectations and personal authenticity. One recipient, a 22-year-old sculptor named Maria Rodriguez, reminded me particularly of my younger self. She had been disowned by her family for refusing to pursue the nursing career they had planned for her, and she was working 3 part-time jobs while trying to maintain her art practice. When I presented her with her grant check at a ceremony, 6 months after the foundation's launch, she broke down crying. "You do not understand what this means," she said through her tears. "My family thinks I am throwing my life away, and there are days when I almost believe them. This makes me feel like maybe I am not crazy for wanting to be an artist." Looking at her, I understood that the strange journey I had taken, from family rejection through fake death to financial philanthropy, had ultimately led me to something more valuable than my father's approval. It had led me to a way of transforming my own painful experiences into support for others facing similar challenges. The fake funeral had served its purpose, though not in the way I had originally imagined. Instead of shocking my father into recognition and reconciliation, it had provided me with the definitive knowledge I needed to stop seeking his validation. That knowledge had freed me to focus my energy on relationships and activities that aligned with my values, rather than continuing to pursue approval that would never come. 3 years after my resurrection, I received an unexpected phone call from my father. It was the longest conversation we had shared in years, and it revealed changes in him that I had not expected. "Sarah," he began, "I have been thinking about our last conversation, about the foundation and what you are trying to accomplish. I still do not fully understand the art world, but I have been reading some articles about the program, and I see that it is making a real difference for young people." I listened with surprise as he continued. "I think I may have been wrong about some things. Not about everything," he added quickly, "but about the idea that what you do does not have value. If it is helping people and creating opportunities, then perhaps I misjudged its importance." The admission was limited and qualified, but it represented more change than I had thought possible. We talked for an hour about the foundation's work, and for the first time I heard something approaching respect in his voice when he discussed my career. By the end of the call, he had made an offer that shocked me completely. "I would like to make a donation to the foundation," he said. "Not a large one, but something that acknowledges the good work you are doing. Would that be appropriate?" His contribution, when it arrived, was accompanied by a note that I kept framed in my office. It read simply, "For Sarah, who had the courage to follow her own path, and the wisdom to help others do the same. From your father, who is still learning." It was not the complete transformation I had once hoped for, but it was something I had never expected, an acknowledgement that my choices had value even if he did not fully understand them. The foundation continued to grow and evolve, eventually expanding beyond grants to include mentorship programs, exhibition opportunities, and workspace initiatives. It became the legacy I was proudest of, a tangible way of ensuring that other young artists would not face the same isolation and rejection that had marked my own journey. Looking back on the entire strange saga, from family rejection through fake death to eventual reconciliation, I realized that the most important revelation had not been about my father's capacity for change. It had been about my own power to define success and meaning on my own terms, regardless of external validation. The funeral had taught me that I could survive the worst possible confirmation of my father's rejection. That knowledge had freed me to stop seeking his approval and start building something that mattered to me independent of his opinion. My father's limited evolution was an unexpected gift, but it was not the source of my peace or self-worth. Those had come from finally understanding that his assessment of my life, whether positive or negative, did not define its value. The Sarah Chen Foundation became more than a philanthropic endeavor. It became proof that meaning and legacy could be created through authentic pursuit of one's values, regardless of family understanding or approval. Years later, when young artists asked me for advice about dealing with family opposition, I would tell them about the funeral where my father said I was nothing, and how that devastating moment had ultimately led to the most meaningful work of my life. Sometimes, I would explain, the greatest gift you can give yourself is the certainty that comes from knowing exactly where you stand, even when that knowledge is painful. Only then can you stop wasting energy on impossible hopes and start building something real with the resources and relationships that actually matter. Up next, you have got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you will not want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.